The doctrine is a legal principle that is applied in different contexts around the world that's based on a racist assumption that colonizing European countries can simply show up on indigenous lands and claim their lands and claim both an interest in and displace indigenous people's authority and laws over those lands. Its inspiration, if I could say it that way, was the papal bulls of the late 15th century, where the Catholic Church assisted in dividing up the world, first of all, between Spain and Portugal, who, if they discovered, quote, new lands, would have the first interest in those lands. That was the inspiration for what became a legal doctrine later. And that was actually 200 years ago. It's the 200th anniversary this year of a really important decision from the United States Supreme Court, where at that time, the court was posed the question, do indigenous people in the United States have any interest in their lands? And the court went back to the papal bulls, to subsequent writings, and inspired by those, came up with this so-called doctrine of discovery, which is basically, sorry, Europeans have shown up, planted a flag, indigenous people do not own their lands any further, and colonizing laws now apply to those lands. I think the so-called repudiation of the doctrine by the Vatican recently really needs to be looked at with a critical eye for a few reasons. First of all, the Pope had a chance to actually do it himself when he visited Canada last summer. It would have meant a lot more if the Pope would have repudiated the doctrine here on Indigenous lands personally. And that's what the call was by Indigenous people all across Canada at the time. My perception was he seemed to have been unprepared for his reception in Canada. It seems to have taken him by surprise. It shouldn't have. How vociferous, how passionate the calls were by Indigenous people for have him here in Canada to personally repudiate the doctrine. He missed that opportunity. Instead, what we had was an announcement, so it looked like a press release from the Vatican when the Pope was unfortunately in hospital. A few things with that. The first of all is that the Church, from my understanding, has always taken the position that they don't need to revoke the doctrine because it's not been part of church law for a long, long time. So instead, they said they were repudiating the doctrine. The problem with that is that the Vatican seemed to point the finger at colonizing countries. If you read the words, they basically say that, well, these colonizing nations, Spain, Portugal, and so forth, they misunderstood and misapplied our teachings. And that was never the Church's intention. I don't think anyone's going to really take that seriously. That's very disingenuous as far as I'm concerned. The Church has known for hundreds of years the basis of the doctrine, that it's been based on those church teachings. The Church has, across the world, benefited financially from the doctrine. So for the Church now to say, well, that's never been our position, it was these colonizing countries that misinterpreted and twisted our words, I don't think that's acceptable. And why that is very concerning is that in Canada, across the world, we have movements towards truth and reconciliation. And what's often lost with that is the truth-telling. Truth comes first. And I thought the Vatican's announcement was an unfortunate example of not telling the truth. Not telling the truth about the church's history, the church's position, and the church benefiting. So that's the first problem with its so-called renunciation. Second is that in order to move ahead in a meaningful way, you need to tell the truth, and then you need to take responsibility and take action. And the church didn't do that. The Vatican didn't do that. If you read what the Vatican wrote, they put the onus on indigenous people now to take action, to forgive the church. You see this across the world. Suddenly the obligation is on indigenous people to do something. The church asking for forgiveness. That's not how it should work. What the church, I say, what the Vatican should have done is say, yes, we own up, we tell the truth, we take responsibility, we don't pass the buck, and this is what we are going to do now to make amends. They didn't do that. What is the church doing itself? Silent. Nothing on that. The church could take the lead on what's referred to in Canada as the land back movement. Giving land back. The doctrine of discovery is based on this illegal usurpation of indigenous land. The different dioceses across Canada, around the world, now claim they own much of that land. That land now is very, very valuable. The church really wanted to be serious about this. They could chart a plan forward for giving it back. Give that land back. And the third thing I think that the church, the Vatican could have done is put the onus on colonizing countries. The church could say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to step up, do something meaningful, take responsibility, and we expect modern day governments in Canada, the United States, Central, South America, to do something. They have an obligation now to do something. The church didn't do that. The church was silent. That kind of moral authority, I think, would have been very helpful, because concern you often have on so-called apologies is these apologies can be weaponized against indigenous people. We've unfortunately seen this before. An example is, as probably a lot of people are aware, of this horrific history of residential schools in Canada where indigenous children were stolen away from their families. Many of them never returned. And you had years ago, several years ago, the federal government made an official apology. Fine, it's good, that can be a meaningful thing. But what I've often seen in those kind of situations, subsequent, when indigenous people continue to call action, meaningful action, critics then pop up and say, what are you complaining about? We apologized. Get over it. And that's how these so-called apologies can be weaponized against indigenous people. So I think it's really important, if there's any so-called apology like that, it has to come with a plan of action that the perpetrator is taking to make amends. And we didn't see that in the Vatican's announcement. So the doctrine was formulated through the United States Supreme Court in the 1820s. Then it worked its way into Canadian law in the late 19th century. And since then, it's become the foundation of Canadian law around Indigenous rights. In Canada, because a lot of Canadians tend to compare themselves to Americans, we're so close, there's often this misunderstanding, well, maybe Indigenous people in Canada don't have it that good, but hey, look south of the 49th parallel, south of the border, the Americans dealt with their Indigenous people a lot worse than Canadians did. This is wrong. This is just historically and legally wrong. Legally it's wrong because the same doctrine underpins property laws in the United States and in Canada. The whole reconciliation process in Canada with Indigenous people is based on that doctrine. Canadians don't like using it. Canadians like to find euphemisms that to put in its place because the doctrine's been denounced all around the world. And so in Canada, we don't refer to the doctrine of discovery. What the courts do in Canada is they use this term called the assertion of Crown sovereignty. And from my perspective, that's just the doctrine of discovery dressed up in softer language because it has the same basis. The assertion of Crown sovereignty in Canadian law is, like it sounds, the Crown shows up, asserts sovereignty over the land. That's the basis of property law in Canada. That's the basis of constitutional law in Canada. And then from there, Indigenous people are put on the back foot all the time. They have to respond now to the Crown that claims their land. And the presumption is that the rights are in the Crown, that it is Crown laws that apply. And Indigenous people are always on the defensive to now make an argument, well, actually, it's our land. We had rights to the land before the colonizers showed up. We still have those rights over the land. We had laws over our lands. We still have those laws over our lands. The problem is they have been denied over and over and over again. So that's at the root of Canadian law. It's ironic because in Canada we have what are called Indigenous land claims. So I do a lot of that work for my First Nation clients themselves. It's a misnomer. And it shows how insidious the doctrine is because my Indigenous clients don't have a land claim. It is provincial and federal governments that claim their land. That's who has the land claim, not my clients. And so this is how the doctrine's worked its way into Canadian law. Now we have a reconciliation project in Canada. We have governments to various degrees commit themselves to reconciliation. From my perspective, it's not likely to succeed any time soon because it's still based on the doctrine. I explain all the time, it's something impossible to do because you're trying to reconcile a right with a lie. And the right is the pre-existing ongoing right of Indigenous people to their lands. And the lie is that colonizers can just show up and claim those lands, usurp their laws. And if that's what reconciliation is, no wonder it doesn't work in Canada. We still have this tension, even when we move forward with resolving these so-called land claims. At the end of the day, they're a current manifestation of the age-old colonial project because the resolution of land claims in Canada are basically about removing Indigenous people from their land so non-Indigenous people can exploit them. That's what a land claim at its most fundamental aspect looks like in Canada. Indigenous people across the country are rejecting that over and over again. They don't want those kinds of land claims. They want agreements with the Crown, with provincial and federal governments that start from recognizing their rights over the land and then setting out a relationship going forward. How are these two government entities, the colonizers and Indigenous people, now going to work together over those lands? How are Indigenous people going to exercise their laws over their land? So that's a very, very, very different vision going forward, and it's one that calls the lie on the doctrine of discovery and says we can't use that as a basis for reconciliation. We have to acknowledge it and chart a new path forward. I often tell people when I'm doing this work, I continue to be optimistic. I don't want to be a cynic. I'm hopeful. The so-called repudiation that the Vatican made, I don't think was particularly helpful, but I think it's a small step forward. I think the way that it helps Indigenous people is that it should put the onus on governments and non-Indigenous people in Canada and around the world. I think part of the concern has been that it's been a way to deflect it, is to say, well, that's something that the Pope should deal with. Well, okay, the Pope or the Vatican, they've dealt with it, maybe not the best way, but they have made this statement. So now I think the responsibility really does move not just to colonizing governments, and I use that term intentionally because I really do see current governments, both in Canada and in a lot of countries around the world, is carrying on that colonizing project. It's not done. One of the misconceptions you often have, both in Canada, in the United States, and around the world, is that this was something about the distant past. Other generations perpetrated these wrongs against Indigenous people. That's not what we do now. That's not right. Canada's colonizing project carries on every day. I think now with the announcement or the pronouncement from the Vatican, the attention really does have to shift to local, provincial, federal government to take action. I think one of the steps going forward is that we have to go back and have real truth telling. I think the Vatican's announcement was an example of we've not had an opportunity to tell the truth. One of the things I've proposed in Canada is that there be a national gathering of truth telling about this, and understanding that the doctrine does underlie Canadians' property system, underlies the Constitution, law-making authority. It was one of the advantages with the Pope coming to visit Canada last summer. I couldn't believe the number of interviews that I did about this, and a lot of the interviewers were surprised the level of interest by non-Indigenous people in these papal bulls that were hundreds of years old. So I think that's a positive thing, but I think we need to push it forward more in a real meaningful way, and particularly starting around the truth telling. The second point I think to keep in mind is that one of the advantages with the announcement from the Vatican is it not only puts the focus on provincial and federal governments, but it puts the focus on local people. What are you doing at a local level? It was interesting because I did an interview about this on a national radio program a few weeks ago, And the next day I had a couple of calls to my office in Vancouver, churches wanting to give land back. None of them were Catholic churches, but still, it's a step forward. People thinking to take personal responsibility. And I think that's something that this could lead to. I could see church congregations all across the country, whether they're Catholic or whatever denomination, taking steps themselves. What are you going to do to make amends? What are you going to do at a real local level? I encourage them, contact the indigenous people whose lands you occupy and try to focus on two main things. How can you ensure that indigenous people whose lands you're on are benefiting from those lands? A lot of these lands now are very valuable. They're being redeveloped, not as churches anymore, but redeveloped as condominium sites, housing, for all kinds, very valuable land. How are indigenous people going to benefit from that? And secondly, how are indigenous people making decisions about those lands? I think the Vatican's announcement puts the focus back on local people to say, we will take steps today to try as best as we can in a limited way to undo the ongoing insidious effects of the doctrine and to ensure that indigenous people are benefiting from their lands and to ensure that indigenous people are making decisions about their lands.